Okay. Oh, it works. Hello, everybody. Sorry for the delay. We were waiting for a few more people to join us after the late morning break. So I'm very happy to see you for this year. I'd like to do a talk about security. This is going to be talk not very technical. There will be some technical stuff, but it's also a talk that can be followed by non-developers or non-very technical people. It's supposed to last for 50 minutes, but now that we've started a little bit late, I'm trying to fit 40 minutes. Before starting, it's customary to introduce myself. So I'm Olivier. I work I've joined Odoo something like 8 years ago, so I'm kind of an old-timer in the team. I've worked in many things in the R&D department, and then the platform, the Odoo online service. And lately, I'm mostly involved also in the security team at Odoo. So that's why I wanted to introduce a little bit more of what we do in terms of security in the product. So I'll give some information about actually my security team, the work we do, and exactly how this matters for you. Then I'll try to introduce important aspects of the framework in terms of security that people may not be familiar with and that I think are important to know when discussing security matters in relation with Odoo. Then I'll show you some evolutions, recent evolutions in the framework in terms of security again. And if we have some time at the end, I'll try to go over a few common mistakes. I try to do that every year to insist on the mistakes that developers tend to do. So this is the part that is a bit more technical at the end of the talk, if we have some time. A word about the security team. It's a relatively new thing at Odoo. I've tried to kind of have a formal security team since 2014, I think, because I used to be involved in managing all the security-related bugs when we were on the old platform, Launchpad, for people who've been with us for a long time. And we decided to create a more formal process for handling security matters. We're actually a rather smallish team with only 4 to 5 people rotating because we have other roles in the company as well. But we try to keep it small because it is important to also keep the confidentiality and the speed of reaction in security-related issues. What are the missions of the security team? Of course, the frontmost mission is to handle the security inbox, so security@odoo.com, where we interact with the community and the increasing community every year of security researchers. We, of course, receive questions and reports from all over the world, but we also receive questions from customers and partners who have doubts about security-related questions in their projects, in their deployments. We try to be very fast in answering these questions. Sometimes there are very complex problems, there are confidential risks, there are data breach risks, the people are very worried, so we try to be as fast as possible, and usually we answer every email we received within 24 hours. We have a formal process when an issue turns out to be a bug, a security bug in the system. In that case, you can actually find on our website, our security page, all the details of how we handle the whole process. I'll not go over all the steps right now. And at the end of this process is usually a security advisory, also known as a CVA, because now we try to issue official CVAs for all security issues we deal with. These are kind of the interface of the security team with the rest of the world. And then the part that I find even more important is the interface of the security team within Odoo, with the rest of the team, with the R&D department, where we have kind of a transversal role, and we try to help reviewing all the tasks that the teams are doing and auditing what they are doing to kind of catch, of course, security problems that could be introduced, but also to simply raise awareness about security matters, because it's difficult to catch all the issues if we are just a small team, but if we can make people aware of all the risks and the good practices that they should be following whenever they develop a new feature, there will be less work for everybody. Because it's not a natural thing for engineers. I don't know how is your experience in your companies, in your teams, but an engineer is usually focused on making things work. They're very good at developing features, making them usable for users, but their main preoccupation is never to think about what the customer could do to break the application on purpose. This is a completely different mindset. When you are, let's say, in the real world, as a comparison, if you are going to your car dealer and you leave your car for some maintenance work, and you come back later to pick it up, you're in the queue, and you see that the clerk is handing back the keys of the cars without doing a lot of routine check to verify the identity of the people and so on. Most people wouldn't really pay attention to this. Someone with this mindset of dealing with how to break systems and processes will immediately see that there's a kind of a security problem there, because anybody could come and claim the keys and go home with the car of someone else because it's not the same clerk that took the car in charge in the morning. So it's really a completely different mindset. And we're lucky to have people in the community who are very active with this mindset and helping us tracking security problems. The small graph here, it may look worrying. It shows the activity in terms of tickets over the past few years since the kind of creation of the security team. And you can see that initially we had like a couple of tickets, emails, or that I call tickets on the security email. 10 in the first year, then 30, then 100, and this year I think we are 150 already. These are, of course, do not translate into security bugs, because that would be quite worrying. Even if the more people looking at the software in terms of security problems, the best chance we have to catch them all. But you see the graph also has the number of advisories that we issued, and fortunately it doesn't grow as fast as the number of tickets. But it shows the raising interest in the community about our product and also about security topics just in general, because it's something that is making the news every day, that there is a data breach or a compromise in this company and this software, this cloud application. So these topics are really important and increasingly important. As a small illustration, this is kind of a breakdown of the kind of tickets that we had to deal with in this last year. You can see on the left side the false positive tickets, or just the tickets that are information requests, or maybe that are just mistakes by security researchers that think that they may have identified a problem, and it actually turns out not to be a bug. On the center of the scale, you have the real questions, like audits that people have been conducting, that customers have commissioned, independent expert audits of their own deployments of Odoo, and they submit these questions, these audits to us for review, so that we can see what part of the audit identified something real, how the customer is supposed to deal with it, if it's on their side, on their responsibility, or if it's something in the software. So we've done quite a few of them over the last few years. And then on the rightmost side of the scale, you have the real security problems, some of them readily exploitable, so that's really the worst cases, that we have to issue security advisories for those and security patches and warn our customers. And there are others that are just bad practice and that could be exploited, but they're not readily exploitable. So in that case, we improve that in the software without necessarily issuing a big alert to customers that are not really at risk. So these security advisories that we issue for the right side of the scale, this is the tip of the iceberg that you can see, but there's a lot more work in the security matters at Odoo. This on the right side of the screen is a screenshot of our GitHub bug tracker with only security issues, and this is where you can find the index of all security releases. And for this, we have the invaluable help of security researchers helping us year after year. Some of them have found incredible issues that you have to combine bugs, different bugs in different parts of the system, and when you make one work with the other, you can find a breach in the system. These guys are doing a really amazing job, and we have a top list of people we want to thank on our website. And I hope, personally, that in the future we'll be able to create a real reward program to better thank these people like other software editors are doing. Now, let's go to a quick overview of some security features of Odoo that developers should know about and that customers and users might want to know about. To introduce and discuss this, I would like to emphasize the fact that developers have to think of Odoo with the security model of Odoo in mind. I have a small graph here that just shows you that the business data is never accessed directly by every part of the software, but that the security model is built on a data access layer that protects the data with groups and rules and basically access control that you can configure. This is one part of the security model. There are many other aspects of Odoo that have security measures in place, and it's important that developers are aware of them. So central to this is, of course, protecting access to the data. In order to illustrate maybe all these kind of ways Odoo can protect your data and, importantly, help the developer avoid mistakes, I'd like to go over a list called the OWASP Top 10 that maybe some of you know, is actually very well known in the security community. OWASP stands for the Open Web Application Security Project. Basically, it's an organization kind of building an index, and you can think of it as a Wikipedia of security problems, describing them, but also how to fight against them, how to detect them, and so on. One of their flagship project is the top 10 that they issue every few years. And this is the top 10 from 2013 because they're still working on the one for 2017, but it's not finalized yet. You have 10 issues here. Basically, those are from A1 to A10. The most common issues that are found in web applications in the wild. It's not specific to Python application, it's just overall in all kinds of web applications. We can try to have a quick word about each of them and how Odoo is equipped to deal with them. The first one, I have kind of a checklist among these top 10, which one Odoo can deal with and which are not covered by Odoo because there may be the responsibility of the deployment. So you have a green check mark next to the one that are fully covered, and a yellow check mark or gray check mark when it's not fully covered. The first one is injection. Is when some data input by the customer is used directly in the software to trigger some piece of code, and the data is included in the query that is sent to the database in an insecure way, which allows malicious users to trigger undesired behavior to execute other operations in the database. So this is typically called SQL injections, and Odoo prevents this by having an API to access the database that blocks these kind of vulnerabilities. The second one is broken authentication. Basically, when you deal with logging, logout in the application, if you implement that yourself, there's a chance that you might get it wrong, that someone might be able to bypass your credential checks. Of course, Odoo provides this for you, so you don't have to worry about that. That's rather obvious. The third one is a different beast. It's difficult to define quickly. Cross-site scripting issues are another kind of injection issues, but usually these happen on a web page of your application where some dynamic scripting is executed. And again, customer-provided or user-provided data is included in this dynamic JavaScript code, again resulting in the customer or the user being able to execute code in the application that doesn't belong there. Sorry. So Odoo deals with that by providing another API, a templating language, QWeb for those who know it, to build web pages in a secure way and avoid these kind of mistakes. For the fourth entry, insecure direct object references, is basically when you click on a link in an email and it brings you to this invoice that belongs to you with an ID, a number in the URL pointing to that invoice. What if you change that number and you increment it by 1 or decrement it by 1? And you end up viewing data from a different person that doesn't belong to you. That's actually a common vulnerability in web applications. There was another one hitting the news like 2 days ago here in Belgium. Odoo prevents this by having this security model that I've shown in the previous slide, where the data access is protected before you can reach the database. So if you are clicking on a link and you are identified as customer A, you will never be able to see data from customer B because the security model prevents it. Regardless of playing with the URLs, you can only access through the data layer, so you're safe. The fifth entry is security misconfiguration. An example would be if you keep a default password that is well known, like Odoo as admin as the default password when you install. Of course, that's not something Odoo can fully cover because it still ends up being the responsibility of the person deploying it. So I cannot say that we cover it, but we try to warn you if you keep admin as the default password. The sixth one, sensitive data exposure, might be anything where at some point someone is able to breach into your data. It could be even your backup systems that an attacker can access and steal the data there. So again, this is not something Odoo can fully protect you from. A7, missing function access control would be if a feature, like a button that you click, allows you to do something, and it would not be properly checking if the user doing it has the right to do it. And someone, maybe a less privileged user, could trick the system and click on the button, and it would be allowed to accomplish something that they should not be allowed to do. Again, the security model and the access control, the way it is designed in Odoo, should prevent this kind of vulnerabilities. 8th item, cross-site request forgery, is another complicated thing where an attacker would be able to trick you into clicking on a link, and the link would execute something in your browser, and because your browser, you are already logged into an application, it would immediately perform an operation. So the attacker, by sending a link, would trigger an operation in your browser, but they would still be executing what they want. This is a well-known class of issue as well in web applications, and Odoo does protect you because usually this is accomplished by attacking HTTP forms with a post request, and Odoo protects that by default with having a CSRF, the alias for cross-site request forgery, protection by default. A9 is using non-vulnerable components. It's actually when you install things on your servers and maybe you're not keeping up the things up to date in terms of security patches. Of course, Odoo cannot protect against that fully, but by having a relatively short set of dependencies and being a full-featured system where you don't have to install a ton of different things to interact and integrate it with, you might be less sensitive to this kind of problem. And the last one, A10, is unvalidated redirect and forwards, which kind of is sometimes considered an issue, is not so much an issue. It's when an application can redirect to an arbitrary website, and some attackers might want to send you a link that appears to be in your application but ends up redirecting to a different application where they could design a website that looks like your application, and so it's a form of phishing where people might be able to attack you. Odoo cannot fully protect you from that because a phishing is still a phishing, so any email could send you to a malicious website that looks like your Odoo without even using a redirection, actually. All right. Let's go over a few changes that we have done recently in Odoo to further enhance the security of the framework and help developers avoid more mistakes. I've kind of ordered them from less important to more important. So we'll start with the less important ones, at least in my book. So we're always adding some extra logging in the Odoo logs, the server logs that are produced by Odoo. We have recently added some for installations of modules, and when requests to install or uninstall a module or upgrade an app in Odoo is allowed or denied to a certain user with the date, the kind of module they were trying to install, the IP address that is doing that operation, and so on. And we have that for login and logout, and we have that for different things. And if you think of an extra log that we should be producing, feel free to suggest it to the security team. We've done a change that is actually an often requested one by security researchers. It's switching the session cookies to HTTP only. If you're not familiar with that, it's a flag that you can set on the cookies in your browser where they will be made unavailable to JavaScript, so they are harder to steal with XSS attacks. we've switched that on as of Odoo 11 because we couldn't, for technical reasons, do it for older versions. We haven't switched on the other flag that you can set, which is the secure cookie, because that makes cookies work only through HTTPS, and that would entirely prevent deploying Odoo over plain HTTP, even for testing. So we cannot do that by default at the moment, but of course we recommend deploying Odoo behind an HTTPS web server. We have introduced recently the option to encrypt the super admin password, the one that is used to control the database management system that you have when you install Odoo or when you want to create an extra database from the UI. It used to be a plain text password, which is not terribly good because in case of compromission of your file system, it would be easy for an attacker to remotely maybe steal that password and perform database management operations. So we now allow it to be encrypted, and actually when you change it as of Odoo 11, it will save it in encrypted form by default. Of course, it's not sufficient because in some cases you might want to entirely block the database management screens when you are in production, because these are mostly for development or setup of a new system. You don't want that for a production system. So that's why we have another new option. Actually, we have improved an existing option. As of Odoo 11, when you use the no database list flag to block access to the list of databases, two things will happen. It will block entirely the database manager. So with or without password, you will not be able to use these screens anymore. But it will also block it at the RPC level. So these database management operations will not be possible anymore at the RPC level, which fully protects you from attackers who might have stolen or trying to brute force your super admin password. That's an important feature. A nice feature as well is that we have now made a technical change to allow you to select the SSL encryption mode for your database connection. This is important if you don't deploy with a local Unix socket connection to your database, which is one way of deploying it. But if your database lives on a different server than the Odoo server, you want to encrypt the connection between the two. And you can now turn this on by default. It's actually on by default because we use the prefer mode. So if your database server supports HTTPS, well, SSL encryption actually, Odoo is going to use it by default. And here is our friend, the Pickle. If you've followed my past talks about security, Pickle is a Python library that we use to have in Odoo and that we made use of for different features. But it's kind of a dangerous library because it's used for serializing data, but it can do a lot more, including executing code when you deserialize data. So it was a pet peeve for a while, and we've worked to completely remove all Pickle encoding or decoding in Odoo as of Odoo 11. When it was necessary to have a serialization, we used JSON now, which is a much safer and portable format for serialization. We have one more little thing that is still using Pickle, is if you are using the database anonymization app that can be used when you plan an upgrade of your Odoo database and you want to upgrade something that is anonymized and then de-anonymize when you get it back from the migration services, the upgrade services. The data is produced in Pickle format, but it's a local Pickle that is safe. So we keep compatibility with that in case, of course, you are upgrading from version 10 to version 11, your anonymization file is in Pickle format. But this is really safe, and we will be able to drop that for next version. Then one that I like a lot more is the way we secure system parameters. So this is also known as the IR-config parameter table. We have introduced in the past a security model for that, where you could select the groups of users that would be able to view or modify, but mostly view the different system parameters. This was not such a good idea because it moved the responsibility to the developer to select the right access groups for each parameter, and also to the system administrator to maintain these. Most of the time, people and developers forgot to properly secure these parameters, and by default, they were readable by everyone, even your website visitors, if they knew how to do that. So that could be quite a security problem. By default in Odoo 11, system parameters are not readable by anyone except the system or the administrator of the database. And apps that need to access a system parameter will have to explicitly go to sudo mode to escalate privileges for a little while, to go into elevated privileges, and then drop those privileges after reading the system parameter. This is considered a much better practice by default, and I'm really happy we were able to do that. Another really nice thing that we did with Odoo 11 is the one I prefer in the new security features, is that we also did a complete review of all the security control on the internal data object in Odoo. What I mean by internal data object is the metadata that drives the screens, the views, the menus, of course also the models, so your database tables, the fields of those database tables. So we used to have a very relaxed set of access control on these tables, which could be quite a security issue if you add important modules or let's say security-related modules installed, and that it could be viewed remotely that you had installed these features by introspecting your these internal tables. So we have now cut, I think, in half the number of tables of internal models that can be read by a non-authenticated user, and we've stripped it to a very minimum, and we are still working on it to further restrict it in the next versions. So this is a rundown of the top improvement I wanted to discuss in the framework. There are many other improvements. This is just a quick highlight. Then, because we have a few minutes left, I'd like to insist on a few common mistakes that developers do when they are making new apps and new modules for Odoo. And those security mistakes are mostly related to ways they would bypass the security features that I've just discussed previously, like this top 10 OWASP problem and the ways we have in Odoo to fight against them. Developers, of course, have a way to bypass these features, and whenever they do that, they are taking big risks. The first and most dangerous issue that we always see is that developers tend to go the easy way to parse text, and sometimes they have a text string, and they want to transfer that into whatever real type of object was there, an integer, a dictionary, a list. And to do that, they can evaluate it as if it was a piece of code. That's a function called eval. And it's definitely not the right way to parse text containing literal declarations of things. But it is a very common mistake. And the problem is that it breaks the barrier between code and data, because you are taking a user data, a bit of user data, and you are evaluating it, which possibly means you are going to execute whatever code might be hiding there, which is definitely not what you want to do when you only want to transform a string representation of an integer into a real integer. So for that, just keep in mind that there are much better ways than eval to parse string literals. You should only ever use eval when you want to execute a piece of logic, because you really are dealing with code and you know that you are dealing with code. It's not a tricky, a sneaky attack for your evaluator. Another case where you want to really use eval is if you are rendering a string and you need to put parameters in that. So of course the parameters are data and you want to inject them in the template string that you are dealing with. In that case, if you are using eval, be really, really careful, be aware that the parameters might be including some code, or that someone might be trying to trick the system. So when you do use eval for the good reasons, do it very carefully, and also be very explicit about doing it. We have a mechanism in Odoo called safe eval that tries to sandbox code when you are evaluating it. Be very explicit when you are using safe eval, because you know you are dealing with dangerous pieces of logic that could be injected by the user. And if you are using the unsafe eval, that is the built-in of Python or JavaScript for that matter, be very explicit that you are doing it because you know why the piece of code that you are evaluating is safe. The second most common issue is doing handcrafted SQL queries. I've discussed the fact that Odoo provides you with an API to query the database and access data, but it doesn't always cut it for a developer. There are reasons why they want some time to execute a real SQL query that they wrote because it's more efficient, because they need to do something special that the framework doesn't do. That's fine. But when they do that, they have to learn how the query API works, and they have to be, again, very sure that they never break the barrier between code and data. SQL queries can take parameters, but they have to be passed to as parameters. Here is an example where we are doing it wrong, because the categ parameter that this function receives is injected directly inside the query by formatting it in the SQL code. This is bad, because if by some way a user is able, or an attacker is able to pass a custom value for the categ parameter, they might be able to execute arbitrary code and damage your database, or escalate to administrator and so on. So in that case, you definitely can use this construct of formatting yourself the query. You have to switch to, for example, this way of doing it, where we see that the category parameter, the categ parameter, is passed to the execute method as an extra parameter and not injected manually in the SQL query text. Another difficult one is XSS. We've discussed that in the top 10 of issues. There are many classes of XSS because there are many indirect ways of sneaking data into your web page. And all of them have to protect against malicious content. Odoo has this QWeb templating language where we can use this construct that we see, task, tfield, to print the content of a field of an object. These are safe to use. Sometimes you want to also inject into a web page some HTML markup that you have constructed, because you'd like to generate it in your code rather than put it in the template. This is usually a bad idea, but sometimes you have to take some HTML bit and inject it into the page. In that case, you use trow, which basically means print this directly in the output of my web page. There are very good ways to do it when you know that some safe HTML was produced. But in many cases, it is unsafe. And there are often ways to work around it and not use it. This slide explains an example. We are dealing with tasks, and tasks have names and attributes. And we'd like to display a small CSS icon next to tasks according to their state. So one way to do it would be what I do here in the center of the slide, with a big no at the bottom, where basically we are producing the full HTML string in Python, and then returning it to the template and using trow to directly inject it into the final page. This is totally unsafe because I'm directly printing the content of the field in the final page. So if the task state or name contains HTML markup that does something malicious to the web page, it will go directly to the customer browser and be executed. A slightly better alternative, the one on the rightmost side, is if you are aware of these possible security issues and you explicitly escape the content of these fields, task state and task name, with an explicit escaping, which will take care of deactivating any markup that could be hiding in these fields. That's a bit better because it's going to be safe for your customers, but that's not the best way to do it. A much better way would be not to use Piraux at all and to find a working solution with just the normal safe primitives. And that's what I'm doing here on the left side of the screen, where you can see that I'm not producing any HTML in Python. Everything is in the template because that's where your view or your presentation layer is, and you're not supposed to be producing that on the Python side. That's just bad practice. And you can accomplish the same here, because instead of directly producing the HTML, I'm setting a dynamic class, you can see here, using this dynamic attribute for generating a class name, in which I am integrating the state of my task. And doing this, if my task has a state that is expected, let's say dawn, this will produce an attribute oTaskDawn, and my CSS code will render, and I will see the proper icon. If some some attacker wanted to pass malicious data and in the state or otherwise try to attack my application, it would break the CSS design because the class would not match. But because it's safely escaped by the template, it would not be a break in my application. That's something that I see very often, even inside Odoo. We tend to see this kind of pattern, so something that developers should really be aware of and trying to avoid doing. And the last one I wanted to highlight here is dealing with sudo. We've seen that one change in Odoo 11 in the framework is that security system parameters need now to be accessed with sudo. So that's another case where your application code has to go to elevated privilege to read a system parameter. But whenever you do that, you have to kind of think that the code is becoming like Spider-Man, super powerful, and you want to deal with the consequences and to keep it as restricted as possible in your code. So have the sudo section of your code as limited as possible. In particular, you want to watch any calls that you will be doing while you are in this environment where the code is in sudo mode, because you are transferring the responsibility to any function that you are calling, and it might not be prepared to deal with all the parameters it receives in sudo mode, and it might be bypassing some access control. You also want to look at some data that you might be leaking after the scope of your sudo section, because these objects might stay in elevated mode because that's a property of the environment of every database record. So there might be a side effect of leaking these objects or returning them. So basically, whenever you see that you need sudo, be very careful and try to limit it and watch all the parameters that you are dealing with at this point, because you never know if a malicious attacker is passing some tricky value to attack your system. This is not all. There are a lot more typical patterns in terms of security. If you are interested, I did last year a much longer talk on these bad patterns that we often see in developer code for Odoo apps. The link is here. There are more examples if you want to see code examples that I went over here very, very briefly. So the things that I wanted you to remember tomorrow, and I'd like everyone to keep in mind, is that Odoo has a lot of security features built in to help developers stay on the safe side and to avoid most of these top 10 OWASP mistakes, and there's more than 10, of course, types of mistakes that you want to avoid. That also we are trying to improve this over time and with every new version. And That, of course, you should not hesitate to contact us if you have any question, if you see a security bug, especially because in our new bug tracker in GitHub, we don't have a way to report a security issue directly. There used to be that in Launchpad, but you cannot do that in GitHub anymore. So always be sure to contact the security team directly, and we'll follow the process through, and we'll be happy to answer any question as you can see, we receive quite a lot of questions every year. Okay, I think I'm supposed to be stopping now. If you have questions, do not hesitate to come to me. There will be other talks that I'm doing, or just email security@odoo.com for any security-related question. Thank you.